Now, we've already looked at Gwen John, but as this is a standalone talk, I might remind you of some of the history of the siblings that I've already covered. Now, as their brother and sister, many critics tend to compare and contrast them because they appear so different. Let's look at the two portraits together again. And what critics see in these is that Augustus is an intense, outgoing person, sociable, and Gwen John is quiet, self-contained. But I hope to show by the end of this talk that it's a little bit different from that, a bit more subtle than that, and we can interpret them and their works a bit differently from the way that they're conventionally seen. Start at the beginning, though. They were both Welsh. They had two other siblings, so there were 4 children. In fact, they regarded themselves as Welsh. When they went to London, they saw themselves as foreigners in London. When they were young, their mother Augusta was very ill, and she died when Gwen was 8 and Augustus was 6. And it was then that they moved to Tenby. So they're conventionally known as artists from Tenby. Their father, Edwin, was a solicitor and cold and distant, although he did continue writing to Gwen when she was in France virtually every week, but she never went to his funeral when he died. Now, Augustus attended a private school in Tenby. He was mischievous. And in fact, when he was at school, on one occasion, a teacher hit him so hard round the head, he remained partially deaf all his life. He attended the Tenby School of Art, and then he went on to the Slade when he was 17. And he was an immediate hit because of his drawing skills. And then Gwen, who was older than him, she eventually got permission from her father and went to the Slade later that same year when she was 19. Then there was a strange event happened. When he was at the Slade, Augustus was described as neat, timid, unremarkable personality. But then in 1897, he returned to Tenby on holiday during a vacation, and he dived into the sea, but the water was much too shallow. He hit his head on the bottom very seriously. He could have died. He went through a long convalescence. And when he returned to the Slade, he was described as a dramatically changed figure. Wyndham Lewis described him as a great man of action into whose hands the fairies had placed a paintbrush instead of a sword. Now, he had red hair, but he grew a red beard after this change, and he became the very image of an unpredictable bohemian artist. His work changed as well. His tutor, Henry Tonks, previously described him as methodical, but after this accident, when he returned, he was described as lively and spontaneous. His drawings, as I said, were always regarded as brilliant. And by the time later, when he left the Slade, when he was 25, he became the most famous British artist of the day. Everyone talked about him. He was compared with Michelangelo, Gauguin, Matisse, and he was legendary as a bohemian artist, and his circle of friends were all of the great and the good of the literary world. But for him, it appears that his art counted for nothing alongside his sister's. He would visit exhibitions of her work and would stare obsessively at her pictures. And when critics ignored her work, he would say, and this is a quote, "To me, the little pictures are almost painfully charged with feeling, even as their neighbours are empty of it. Gwen's pictures are simply staggering. So, how could he have felt? He was lauded as a great artist, but he believed his sister was by far the greater artist. In fact, he said, and this is a quote, 50 years after my death, which would have been 2011, I shall be remembered as Gwen John's brother. And he was right. She's now regarded as one of the most important British artists of the 20th century. And he was almost forgotten, although in the last 10 years, his work has been reevaluated, because he was, remember, he was at the time regarded as the leading British artist. He was wild, bohemian, society portrait painter. It's actually rumoured that he fathered over 100 children through numerous affairs during his life, but I think that figure is probably exaggerated. Let's look at his drawings. He was a star pupil at the Slade. His drawings were described as the best since Michelangelo. Now, the women he's drawing here are important. The person on the left, Ursula Tyrwhitt, was the closest to Augustus when he first joined the Slade. He became infatuated with her. But the woman in the middle is Ida Nettleship, and he transferred his affections to her and married her in 1901 after he'd left the Slade. The woman in the background at the top right is Gwen John, of course, and he added her to the drawing later. She's holding the back of a chair. And the interesting thing about this drawing is that it sold at Christie's in 2005 for £60,000, which is the highest price he's ever paid for a drawing by Augustus John. Now, these drawings, and I'll show you another one. This is another painting, another drawing of Gwen John seated by a fireplace. His drawings were compared with Antoine Watteau. And in fact, I'll show you a drawing by Watteau. He won a competition that involved copying Watteau's drawings. Now, when they first went to the Slade, the brother and sister Gwen and Augustus lived together at 21 Fitzroy Street. It's unfortunately been pulled down, but it's now an office block. It's an office block just underneath the BT Tower. And the landlady was a fellow student, but an eccentric older student at the Slade. But this here is not her, it's his first commission. He painted it at the sitter's house, and the fee he received for this painting was, well, in fact, he never received it, but the fee agreed was £40, which was a substantial sum for an unknown artist. And I think it tells us a lot about Augustus when I tell you that he abandoned the painting because he didn't get on with her. He didn't want to go back and finish it, which is remarkable when you think that he'd just come out of college, he needed to make a name for himself, and he'd received this substantial commission, but he couldn't be bothered to finish the painting because he didn't like the sitter, and he left the painting with her without being paid. You'll notice, by the way, that it's not completely finished. Look at her right hand is unfinished, but nevertheless it's remarkable for its realism. In fact, it's this simple pose and the plainness reminds us more, I think, of Gwen's portraits than some of Augustus's later portraits. A few portraits here that enable me to talk a bit more about his personal circumstances. I said that in 1901 he married Ida Nettleship, and this is a portrait of Ida. She was the daughter of an artist, and in fact went to the Slade when she was 15, so could have become a substantial artist in her own right. And this portrait, notice it's cracked since it was painting, so the craquelure on the painting is more recent. It was his first critical success. It was described by the New English Art Club as Picture of the Year. The title, by the way, Merically, I think it's pronounced, is a Gypsy word meaning an ornament worn round the neck, especially coral, and you can see she's wearing a coral necklace. And he was obsessed by the what he called the Gypsy or Romany, as we would say now, Romany way of life. And he's painted her here as a gypsy. Now, after he'd married her, he accepted a post at the University of Liverpool, and they both went up to Liverpool between 1901 and 1904. And this was painted then. You might, I guess, think that he hated Liverpool, but in fact he loved it. He loved the docks. They both did. They loved the energy and the mixture of people from all over the world. They fitted in well. And you might also perhaps think he was a poor teacher, but he wasn't. Although the other staff there first looked in doubt at his long hair and his gold earrings, he turned out to be an excellent teacher. He worked alongside the students, learning with them. Now, Ida was, as I said, a student at the Slade when she was just 15, and she studied there until she was 21, winning prizes and traveling around. She went to Italy, she went to Paris, she shared a flat with Gwen John, and they both studied under James Whistler. And then at the end of her time at the Slade is when she met Augustus, and they married in 1901, as I said. Their first child, David, was born in Liverpool, and it's possible that, in fact, probably likely, that she would have been a great artist because she was a star pupil at the Slade, but she had children one after the other, and it became too much to continue painting and look after the children. And Augustus didn't help at all with the family. In 1903, Aurelia MacNeil became Augustus's model and then his mistress, and the three lived in a ménage à trois. And by 1907, Ida had had 5 children and Aurelia had had 2 sons, and she had given up her career completely to look after the children. Talked about or wrote about to her friends about leaving Augustus because she still wanted to get back to her career as an artist, but she died in childbirth in 1907 after the birth of her 5th son. And people ask why there's no great women artists. This is Aurelia, and this would have been seen at the time as a picture of a gypsy because of what she's wearing. In fact, the critic Roger Fry wrote about this picture: the vitality of this gypsy Gioconda is fierce, disquieting, and emphatic. Now, the model, Aurelia MacNeil, was the model for this. So this is Aurelia, is the model for this picture, and she made her own clothes, and in fact she made these clothes in the style of what they saw gypsies wearing. And Augustus was I was going to say interested, probably a better word was obsessed with the Romany people. And he learnt their language. He traveled the countryside in a gypsy caravan at one point. He dressed his wife and his mistress as gypsies. He became the president of the Gypsy Law Society later. And you might wonder why. Well, his biographer suggests it might be that he loved the gypsy life because when, as a child, he was naughty, which was often, his father threatened to give him to the gypsies. And we know from what he wrote later that although he didn't say anything to the father, he secretly thought that this would be a far better life. And he lived and dreamed of running away and living with the gypsies. So from an early age, he had fallen in love with the gypsy lifestyle. It was actually Gwen that first met Dorelia, whose name is actually Dorothy. Dorothy MacNeil met Gwen, and Gwen introduced her to Augustus. And it was Augustus that decided to call her Dorelia, and the name stuck. Surprisingly, you might be surprised, although you might remember from what I told you before about Gwen John, that she, I think the right word might be eloped. She eloped with Dorelia, and they walked through France, planning to walk to Rome, but they reached as far as Toulouse, sleeping out rough in fields and in barns on the way. And they both returned to Paris, where they shared quarters. Now, in 1904, Dorelia, who'd already knew Augustus, left with a Belgian artist and went to Belgium. And in a panic, Gwen wrote to Augustus, who was living in England, and he rushed over from England, went to Belgium and persuaded Dorelia to come back with him, which she did. And then it was then that Augustus and his wife Ida and Dorelia lived in this ménage à trois, and it was then that they travelled around the West Country in a gypsy caravan. Ida was described by people who knew her as a wild thing, and some people called her a witch. She was not born, and she said this herself, she wasn't born to be a mother. So there were strains in the relationship because she had one child after another, and she had to spend all of her time looking after the children. She died of an infection following the birth of her fifth son, and Augustus lived for the rest of his life with Dorelia, and they had 4 children, although they never married. And Dorelia looked after Ida's children and her own. So Dorelia was looking after 9 children, one of whom became first Sea Lord, and another became a well-known artist. What I thought I'd do at this point is just compare you with another well-known artist of the period, so you can see the difference and what was happening in art at the time. This is by John Singer Sargent, Lady Agnew of Lucknow, and it was Sargent who was the leading society portrait painter of this period. In fact, it was Virginia Woolf said in 1908 that the era of John Singer Sargent was over, the age of Augustus John was dawning. So when I said Augustus John became the leading society painter, he actually replaced John Singer Sargent. Now, this portrait of Lady Agnew is a portrait of a wealthy socialite. You can look at her fine clothes, her brooch, her expensive chair, everything that was expected in a portrait at the time. Although Sargent was also a controversial artist, and you can see that in her unusually direct gaze and the sort of slouching pose, if you like. But nevertheless, although he was controversial, it was in an acceptable sense, and he was the leading society painter. You can also see how loosely he painted her dress. I think you can see in this reproduction or this image of the painting how loosely the clothing is painted with just a few brush strokes. It was exhibited in 1893, and added to his reputation. He became described as the Van Dyck of our times, which is a phrase that was used to describe Augustus John for this painting, Woman Smiling. So that was a major change. People expected, when they went to an exhibition, portraits to be of people of rank and fortune, and Augustus John has intentionally painted someone that no one knew. Dorelia was his model, and someone dressed in Romany clothing. The other, because I mentioned the Romanies, I thought I'd show you another artist who often painted Romany way of life, and that's Alfred Munnings. But he, in fact, had no particular love of their way of life. His love was painting horses, and he was one of England's finest, I guess along with Stubbs, one of England's finest painters of horses. And he grew up around horses. But here at Epsom Downs, he's painted a Romany encampment, and it's a sort of real, it wasn't painted on the spot. He made sketches on the spot and painted in his studio later, but it's an accurate portrayal of a camp. Whereas Augustus, of course, in painting this this woman smiling in Romany clothes, the clothes are invented by Dorelia himself. She made them, and she's not a gypsy. So it's Augustus who's actually invented. He actually said that the reason he didn't draw and paint gypsies is that whenever he asked them to sit for him, they would adopt a pose. So that's Alfred Munnings, by the way, is the person who became president of the Royal Academy later during the Second World War, and he's the one who is known for his speech at the Royal Academy, which unfortunately for him was broadcast to millions on the radio, when he became drunk and claimed Cézanne, Matisse and Picasso had corrupted art, which created a scandal. And in fact, it was him that a few years later tried in vain to bring a police prosecution against Stanley Spencer for obscenity. So, and I think that tells us about the way the Royal Academy was in those days. It represented the old school. One final portrait of Dorelia. This is Dorelia standing before a fence. She was, when Gwen met her, she was a typist from Camberwell, but she attended evening classes in art at the Westminster School of Art, which is where she met Gwen John. She was described variously at the time. Some people said she was so beautiful you couldn't take your eyes off her. Others said she wasn't a conventional beauty, but was very sharp. Some people described her as someone to fear, very direct in manner, not a person to mess with. She didn't engage in small talk, and when she spoke, occasionally it was in a very deep voice. And her taste before Gwen met her was to dress in what you might call artistic clothes, and this caused Augustus, when he met her, to fantasize that she had gypsy ancestors. So that in fact is why he called her Dorelia, because he regarded as a gypsy name, and she dressed in these clothes that were regarded as the clothes of the as gypsy clothes. Right, this is the first famous personality that we've seen. It's the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. Now, in a letter that Yeats wrote to John Quinn, and if you remember, John Quinn was the American patron of Gwen John's work and bought a large amount of her work. He was also bought some of Augustus John's work, and Yeats wrote to him, Augustus John has been staying at Coole, which is an estate in Ireland. He came there to do an etching of me for the collected edition. I don't know what John will make of me. He made a lot of sketches with the brush and the pencil to work the etching, and I felt rather the martyr going to him. He exaggerates every little hill and hollow of the face till one looks a gypsy grown old in wickedness and hardship. Now, the drawing is one of those pencil sketches that Yeats mentioned. It's now in Manchester, and sorry, in the Tate. The drawings are in the Tate, and the painting is in Manchester. Coole Park, I'll mention later. It was an estate owned by the Gregory family, and Lady Gregory invited literary figures to come to Coole Park, where she looked after them. It was a sort of a refuge for artists. This is Deralia in Normandy. It's painted the year after Ida had died, and she, Deralia, modelled for both Gwen and Augustus, and the two of them are regarded by some as the sort of perfect example of this bohemian lifestyle, bohemian fashion. She's shown here with David, who is Ida's first child, who was then 6. And he must have remembered his mother then. It was a year since she died, but later none of her children really remember her, and she was never mentioned or discussed by the family at all. They said when they were older. And in Augustus's autobiography that he wrote later, he never mentions her at all. This is Alderney Manor. This is where Augustus, Deralia, and all the children moved in 1911. And they stayed there. They lived there till 1927. It's a sort of toy castle, I suppose you'd describe it. It's a strange architectural structure, but it was surrounded by a large estate described as an amazing place, a vast secluded park of prairies, pine woods, birch woods, dells and moors, through which the children ran free. Remember, there were 9 children, and Deralia looked after them all and turned it into a home of flowers, huge stews, soups, wood fires, and guests were frequently invited there. Many artists and literary figures stayed there. It wasn't a tidy house. One of the guests said that he had left his hat on the floor, and when he went back there 6 months later, it was still there in the same place. The children ran free when they weren't modelling for Augustus. They ran free through the woods and over the heath. The family kept cows, pigeons, a monkey, donkeys, pigs, ponies, cart horses, dogs, cats, and 12 hives of dangerous bees that stung anyone that went near. Incidentally, the house has since been demolished, and it made way for a housing estate, which is what's there now. This was painted in the grounds of Alderney Manor. It's called the Blue Pool, and I think it's one of his most famous works. This is Deralia posing for him by the pool. Incidentally, it was blue because of suspended particles of clay in the water, so it was a deep turquoise blue, whatever the weather. And you might think, from everything I've said about Alderney Manor, that he was very happy there, but he wasn't. He was described as morose, and also he was a strict Victorian father. You might imagine, as a bohemian artist, he was relaxed, but I'll give you an example of one of the incidents. One of the children, one of the boys, would always sniff his food before eating it, and this really annoyed Augustus. He hated it, and one day he got up and pushed his son's face into the food, and the boy rebelled and threw the plate out of the window. So Augustus made him go outside, scrape the food off the gravel driveway, bringing it back in and eat it all. So that was what I meant by strict Victorian father. Now, this large painting is one of 3 that was commissioned by Sir Hugh Lane for his house in Cheyne Walk in Chelsea. I'll just showing you this one. One of them was later overpainted, and the other one of the 3 is in Detroit. He started work on them in 1909 and worked and reworked them until 1915, when Sir Hugh Lane died on the Lusitania. He was on the Lusitania when it was sunk by a German U-boat. Now, the planning for these paintings began in 1907. Augustus wrote, "I'm about to paint a picture which will prove conclusively that the finest decoration can be produced without any direct reference to visual nature," or in other words, he produced it from his imagination. He didn't go outside and sketch the land. The figures, the models, are based on friends and family, his children. The woman on the far right is Ida, and the woman with the guitar is Deralia. But when his patron died, he stopped work on it, and it's never finished. He described later that although he said it has no symbolic meaning, it's perhaps in a dream he has caught a glimpse of the golden age, is what he wrote. Now, I'm going to show you a series of portraits of the good and the great, for which he's best known. This is from the Fitzwilliam Gallery. They provide, I think, a better reference point for comparison with Gwen, because, of course, Gwen John, as far as I can remember, I don't think she painted any socialites, any of the rich and the famous. Now, although I'm going to show you this series of portraits, I should emphasize that he did continue to paint a lot of outdoors, a lot of landscapes, a lot of pictures of Deralia and of the family. But also I'll come on to later in life. Now, this painting of George Bernard Shaw, he was done during a brief stay at Coole Park again, Lady Gregory's estate in Galway. And he did 3 paintings of Shaw. One's in the National Portrait Gallery, one of the drawings he did for these paintings. This painting is in the Fitzwilliam, another's in the Royal Collection, and another is in one of the National Trust building, Shaw's Corner, I think. In his memoirs, he describes the visit and the meeting of Shaw in some detail. He says that when he arrived there in Ireland, he was in poor shape with a cough, which he described as organic and incurable. But he said the chauffeur drove him to a chemist where he ordered up a concoction of ingredients, and that swiftly brought him back to full health. So it doesn't sound as though he was that ill, and faced the task with confidence, as he put it. They became well acquainted, Augustus and Shaw, and they both admired and irritated each other. In one letter, he referred back to Duralia, he refers to Shaw as ridiculous, vain object in knickerbockers. But in his autobiography, Augustus says that what I have sketched here was more than an ordinary episode. It was a great occasion, for I have come to know in intimacy a true prince of the spirit, a fearless enemy of cant and humbug. So that's a much more positive view of Shaw. And Shaw would keep one of these portraits for the rest of his life, although he did also describe them as being immortalized as an elderly caricature. But he, as I said, kept the paintings for the rest of his life. You might recognize this, David Lloyd George, now in Aberdeen Art Gallery. Now, by this time, by the way, 1916, Augustus was at the peak of his reputation in society, and was an established society portrait painter and making a good income. Although some art critics felt that his career hadn't lived up to the potential that he showed at the Slade, but he did go from strength to strength as a painter of the rich and famous. Now, this portrait came about in an unusual way. In 2015, the chairman of Aberdeen Art Gallery paid 210 guineas for a blank canvas from Augustus John, and the promise that whoever the chairman chose, Augustus John would paint their portrait. Now, perhaps many people would have chosen themselves. I mean, he was chairman of the Aberdeen Art Gallery, but he didn't seem to think of that. He had recently met and dined with Lloyd George, and they were good friends. And he asked Lloyd George, or persuaded Lloyd George, who had just become Minister of Munitions, to sit for Augustus. Augustus said he was a fine subject, but a bad sitter. And when the painting was eventually finished, Augustus tended to have very many sittings for his portraits. He gave, the chairman gave Lloyd George a box of cigars for, as he put it, the boy, that is Lloyd George, who had come well out of a trying ordeal. And Lloyd George confessed, no one but you could have made me do this, because of the length of time that she could barely spare to sit for Augustus. And that was, as you're probably thinking, or as I alluded to, because he became Minister of Munitions, was in the middle of World War I. Now, you might be wondering, what did Augustus do? He became a war artist in the First World War for the Canadian War Memorials Fund to record Canada's role in the war. He was billeted out to the Somme. He wrote back that he enjoyed being there, but he suffered from what he called, I'm not quite sure what he meant by this, but what he called paranoia. Maybe he believed everyone was trying to kill him, which I guess they were. But he also wrote that I cannot stand anybody, and he could see no good in anything at this time. Amusingly, though, as a war artist, he was allowed, and he was the only officer in the British Army to be allowed to wear a beard. That is the only one, except for the king. So when Augustus would turn up from a distance, because he had a beard, a lot of ordinary soldiers took it for the king arriving, and so he was frequently granted by a whole line of soldiers standing and saluting him. Having said that, he was almost court-martialed for hitting a fellow officer, but he was saved from the court-martial by his Lord Beaverbrook, who was a friend of his. And he returned to England, and Augustus didn't go back to the war front. Now, after the war, let's get on to this portrait we're looking at. After the war, he found success painting famous society figures, Thomas Hardy, James Joyce, and here T. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, who became famous, as you'll know, as the military liaison officer between the British forces and the Arab revolt. And he was the driving force behind the Arabs' offensive against the Turks, which he wrote about later after the war in 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And then later in 1935, he died in a motorcycle accident. The government selected Augustus John and William Orpen as the 2 most famous British artists at the time to attend the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. And it was there during the conference that Augustus became friends with Lawrence, and Lawrence sat for this portrait. He was always amused by the result. He thought that this one, he looked rebellious. He wanted to buy the portrait, but it was too expensive. And Augustus painted 2 others. He painted 3 portraits, and one Lawrence described as the goody-goody one, and the other Augustus described as a dud. Also at the Peace Conference in 1919, he met Marchesa Cassetti, and she was a famous society socialite, extravagant, narcissistic. Her exploits were legendary. He got to know her well. He painted her 4 times, and they remained friends for 35 years. I don't know whether this was a sort of an amusing joke, but the mountains in the distance and her smile, I think I meant to allude to Leonardo's Mona Lisa, but the Marchesa in her silk pajamas and heavily made up eyes, I think is more seductive than mysterious. She was so well known. There's something like 125 portraits of her, but this portrait is generally regarded as one of the most successful. Her full name, by the way, was Luisa Marchesa Cassetti Stampa di Soncino, and she was an heiress, muse, patron of the arts. She astonished society. She would parade around with a pair of cheetahs on a lead. She would wear live snakes as jewelry, and so on and so on. She lived in the palazzo in Venice that's now the Peggy Guggenheim Museum. But eventually, although she was an heiress, she spent all the money. She ended up $25 million in debt, fled to London, where she lived in poverty in a 1-bedroom flat. And Augustus continued to visit her and to know her. A very different, but another socialite and art lover. This is Lady Ottoline Morell, and she met Augustus originally in 1906, and they had a brief affair in 1908. He began this portrait in 1918, and it was exhibited in 1920, where most people who saw it were critical of it. The Star newspaper called it a grotesque travesty of aristocratic, almost imbecile hauteur. And well, the Guardian was a bit more positive. It called it an ideal portrait in the Johnian sense, in the way it makes life more exciting and fantastic and unlikely. And Augustus's biographer described it as, her eyes rolled sideways in their sockets like those of a runaway horse, and her mouth bared soundlessly. Now, after all of that, you might be surprised to hear that Lady Ottoline actually liked it and hung it over the mantelpiece in her drawing room in her London house. Many regard this as his finest painting. This is a cellist, a Portuguese cellist, Madame Sugia, who lived in London from about 1914. She was born in Portugal, as I said. And at the time, a solo female cello player was rare. So she was a hit in society. She was very well-known artist. The painting was commissioned, but the commission lapsed because Augustus took so long painting it, but he continued and finished it on his own. It took 3 years, 70 sittings, and he repainted it frequently. He, for example, changed the color of her dress. It started out as gold, it then went to white, and finally ended up with as red. Now, Augustus met Thomas Hardy through T.E. Lawrence in 1923, and he visited Thomas Hardy at Maxgate, the house that Hardy designed and built for himself in Dorchester. And he worked on this affectionate and admiring portrait. This is the study behind him where Hardy wrote Jude the Obscure. And Augustus revered Hardy, which he felt to some extent. Well, let me read a quote. An atmosphere of great sympathy and almost complete understanding at once established itself between us. Though the veneration in which I held Hardy impeded to some extent the natural expression of my response to his quiet, lovable personality. Now, John Augustus that it recorded in his memoirs that Hardy wasn't a physically substantial person. What he wrote is he wasn't of monumental build, although he had a fine head. So what he's done here to give him a substantial build is he's brought him forward near the front of it. We're quite close to him, and he's filled the bottom part of the canvas with this grey suit and these strong, large hands with these big thumbs to give his a certain stature, with a fine head on top. And it was about, this is 1923, I would say about 1925, he'd probably reached the peak of his reputation as a fashionable society portrait painter. So it was from about 1916 to 1925. But he had established himself as a leading, very well-known British artist. And in 1921, he became an associate of the Royal Academy, and in 1928, a full academician. And then a bit later, he became a trustee of the Tate Gallery. In 1927, he left Alderney Manor and moved to Friern Court, which was shown here. It was, well, it's near Fordingbridge, and which is described as the northern gateway to the New Forest. So a lot of people describe this house as being in the New Forest. Looking at the bottom of the picture, this is his studio. It was designed by Christopher Nicholson. Now, Augustus was a good friend of Ben Nicholson, the abstract artist, and Ben Nicholson was Christopher Nicholson's father. Christopher, or Kit Nicholson, was the architect who designed this. The studio was on the first floor. You can see the high ceilings and the high windows that he designed. And the ground floor was a storage room for his artworks and his materials. And it was later converted, as you can see here, into an apartment, 3-bedroomed apartment. Now, there were many gypsies living in the New Forest, and Augustus fought their battle for their rights. He knew them well. They called him Saint Sir Augustus, and he became known as the King of Bohemia amongst the gypsies. And he lived in this house till his death, aged 83 in 1961. And the house was destroyed by fire, which is the picture I'm showing you at the top, in 2011. Oh, that's if you go to Fordingbridge, you might find alongside, I think it's the River Avon, this statue that was completed of Augustus John. Just a few more of his portraits. This is Joseph Hone. By this stage, well, the year previously, he'd turned 53 and was described as old, grey-haired, with bloodshot eyes. And when he painted this, Augustus was suffered from bouts of gloom and was filled with self-doubt. And he was often lived quietly on his own, found comfort in alcohol. And by the 1930s, he'd long outlived his popularity, although he was still a Royal Academician. Nevertheless, as we can see here, he could still conjure up a likeness of a person with a few brushstrokes. Joseph Hone, by the way, was an old friend of his, and he was the biographer of W.B. Yeats. And he came to stay with Augustus at Friern Court, which is where this was painted. Augustus, by the way, didn't like this. He was unhappy with the portrait, but he never, he left it as he'd finished it, which is, and it's now in the Tate. This perhaps is Augustus John's most famous portrait, I would argue, Dylan Thomas. Now, he met Dylan Thomas at the Fitzroy Tavern probably in 1935. And it was Augustus that introduced Dylan Thomas to Kathleen McNamara, who Thomas married a couple of years later in 1937. And this is one of a pair of portraits of Dylan Thomas when he was, well, when this was painted, he was 23. And they stayed, that is, Dylan Thomas and his wife, Kathleen, stayed with the at John's house in Frion Court. Now, Augustus John said later that I got him to sit for me twice, the second portrait being the more successful. Provided with a bottle of beer, he sat very patiently. And I should think he needed to, as Augustus John took so long on his portraits. I'm not sure which of the two is the second one, that is the more successful one, as he described it, but I would imagine it's the one on the right. One critic, by the way, said the painterly brilliance of his early work degenerated into flashiness and bombast, and the second half of his long career added little to his achievement. I think we would exclude this work, and also perhaps the work he did on a trip to Jamaica in 1937. Now, when he went to Jamaica, it was a British colony, and there were the first stirrings of revolt against the poor wages and working conditions. And when he arrived, he was mistaken at first for a politician, but he sympathized with the Jamaican people and painted the Jamaican people there. Perhaps his attitude, as described in his letters, would be described today as patronizing, but for the time, at the time, he was supporting the Jamaican people in a way that few others were doing. And it was an inspiration to him. He was inspired to do these works. He painted hotel workers and other people that he met there. The one on the left is in the Walker Art Gallery. The woman in front looks a bit bored. Her companion seems a bit apprehensive. And the one on the right is at the Tate. And I believe that it's going to be on display at the Tate from the 30th of, or it was on display from the 30th of October 2022 this year. But check, if you want to see it, check before visiting. In 1941, Augustus was offered a knighthood, but Buckingham Palace insisted he married Aurelia, and he proposed to her on one knee, but she then refused, as she considered it inappropriate after so long for him to propose for what she considered to be completely the wrong reason. But so he didn't marry her, but he was consoled by being awarded the Order of Merit, which didn't need him to marry her. Now, in the following year, 1942, he painted this portrait of Montgomery, which Montgomery had commissioned for £500, a portrait to give to his son in case he didn't survive the war. When he was painting it, he was visited in the studio by George Bernard Shaw, who saw at once that they hadn't hit it off. And there was, in fact, instant dislike between Montgomery and Augustus John. When it was finished, Montgomery said, "I don't like it and I won't pay for it." And he didn't. So Augustus kept the painting, and as it happens, Augustus was very happy with that because he sold it to someone else for much more money. And Bernard Shaw said, "You weren't really interested in the man, were you?" Which he wasn't. I mean, I'll mention in a moment that that during World War II, Augustus John was a pacifist and didn't believe in the war. So it's in some ways maybe not surprising they didn't hit it off. And I'm coming towards the end now, and I thought I would end with this painting he did towards the end of his life. I haven't shown you many in the last 25 years of his life because they aren't his best paintings. But I thought I'd show you this one of Doralia, who'd been his partner for 58 years. He died 2 years after this was painted, and she continued to live at Friar Court until she died 8 years later. Now, in old age, he'd ceased to be important as a force in British art, but he was still revered. There was a huge exhibition of his work at the Royal Academy in 1954. He became, as I said, he was a pacifist and became a founding member of the Committee of 100. That's the British anti-war group headed by Bertrand Russell. And a month before he died, Augustus attended an anti-nuclear weapons demonstration in Trafalgar Square, and he died at home in Friar Court. When he died, in his obituary, the New York Times described him as the grand old man of British painting, one of the greatest in British history. And there was a major exhibition of his work and Gwen John's work at the Tate in 2004-5. It was called Gwen John and Augustus John. And by that stage, it was Gwen John that was the great painter. And in fact, the curators of the exhibition said they went out of their way to show how great an artist Augustus John was, because he wasn't by then regarded as a great artist. And I think in the last 10, 15 years, his reputation has recovered and his work has been reevaluated. I said at the beginning that brother and sister artists are unusual. Not unknown, Rosa Bonheur had her brother was a fairly well-known artist, Auguste, but there are a few others, but Augustus and Gwen John are the two individually best known brother and sister artists, and so commentators often compare and contrasted them, and it's easy to fall into this sort of trap of regarding Augustus and his painting as flamboyant, sociable, outgoing, and Gwen John as quiet, introverted, preferring her own company. And this, I think, has been projected onto their work. But let me just finish with a slightly alternative view. She was, we know from what Augustus wrote, she was haughty, amorous, and proud, had outrageous passions for men and women. And it's said that no one who ever met her forgot the experience. He was sexually promiscuous, a pacifist, an anti-war campaigner, a supporter of the underdog. They both hated sentimentality. They were both acclaimed international artists. They both followed a traditional artistic path. They both rejected modern art movements like Cubism and abstraction. But I think the difference lies in that Augustus shows us the beginnings, the possibilities. It's like the sunrise, if you like, before the story has begun. It's all potential. Or if you prefer, it's a bit like the view of a child when everything is possible, the potential. Whereas Gwen shows us the end of the story, the sunset, calm, relaxed. It's a story more of old age and wisdom when everything has taken place. And let me end with that quote that I gave you before from Augustus writing about Gwen. Gwen and I were not opposites, but much the same, really. We just took different attitudes. I am rarely exuberant. She was always so, latterly in a tragic way. She wasn't chaste or subdued, but amorous and proud. She didn't steal through life, but preserved a haughty independence, which some people mistook for humility. Her passions for both men and women were often outrageous and irrational, and she was never unnoticed by those who had access to her. Thank you. That brings me to the end of this two-part talk on Gwen and Augustus John. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for your time.